Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.
Over the 2023 Christmas period, there were two new stage adaptations of stories by popular children's author Roald Dahl at opposite ends of the country. The Witches at the National Theatre in London and The Enormous Crocodile at Leeds Playhouse. These two shows are the first to be co-produced by the Roald Dahl Story Company. I spoke to the company's artistic director of theatre, Jenny Worton, and I asked her, first of all, to explain what is the Roald Dahl Story Company.
The Roald Dahl Story Company essentially began life as the estate of Roald Dahl, so the organisation responsible for all of the rights to Dahl's stories. And then over time, as we evolved into a company that was becoming more and more involved with the different iterations of the way those rights were being used and more creatively involved, we realized that it was not really appropriate to keep calling ourselves a sort of a literary estate. And actually, we came to the conclusion that the Roald Dahl Story Company was a much better description of our activities and being involved in the many different iterations of Dahl stories.
Right. And is that the point when you were brought in as a playwright and literary manager to deal with that?
Actually, it happened a little bit afterwards and sort of as a consequence of some of that work, which was happening in the theatre department, because when I was first brought in, it was still the literary estate of Roald Dahl. And we have obviously a brilliant agent in the form of Mel Kenyon, who had been putting together lots of creative teams over the years and helped guiding the process. And when Mel called me to say, I think you should come and meet the Dahl estate, it was very much with a view to saying they want somebody to come in and work more closely with the artists that are under commission. And then when I came in and I met Luke Kelly, who was the MD at the time, who's Dahl's grandson, this is going back like 6.5 years. And we started talking about it. I began to understand that what Luke really wanted was to have a much closer relationship with all of the artists that were working on the adaptations, and to feel that there was a sort of consistency, I guess, across the board of all the different interpretations of the work, so that we could both have something about the kind of timeless spirit of Dahl at the same time as the very present tense contemporary ideas and expertise of artists who are interpreting it. And at that point, Luke and I started to work together to stop licensing out the rights to individual theatre companies, but rather to begin a slate of commissioned work ourselves. So it was very much trying to respond to what was happening in-house anyway at the Roald Dahl Company at the time, before we became the Story Company. And I guess trying to kind of close the gap directly between us as the sort of experts in all things Roald Dahl and the artists who are working on the shows for contemporary audiences.
So you're acting as more than an estate. You're actually, I suppose, the only other one I can think of is the Agatha Christie Company does something similar, I think, in that they actually actively produce shows. Does that include funding productions of shows as well? Do you put funding into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we basically fund all of the development part of the process. And so we commission artists directly. We build the teams together, and then we take responsibility for the development spend, because particularly if it's a new musical, as you know, it can take a very long time to develop a new musical. So we cover the development costs up until the point that we feel really confident that the show is headed in the right direction and that we've got the right team, and that we're going to get to a place where we're very confident with the show that goes out there. And then during the process, we invite partners to come and work with us. So we don't produce on our own. Both my background and Anna Schmitz, who's my partner in crime, who's our producer, have a background within subsidised theatre and also some commercial theatre. And so we really recognise that we want to work within the sector, and that like really great new writing is born with the support of the subsidised sector and also with the commercial sector. So we want to hold the early stages of development to make sure that the creative direction of travel feels like it's really true to Dahl, but also really exciting for audiences.
And that, I suppose, makes it more attractive to theatres because it's that development process of a new work that's the most expensive part, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The thing is that we don't have to move towards a particular slot. So we try, I think one of the pressures, obviously, when you've got a theatre to run is that you have to fill your schedule. And so one of the things that we began with, one of our sort of tenets, is that is nothing leaves the inventing room until it's ready. So we have to make sure we maintain momentum over kind of years of development of something. But yes, we try really hard to make sure that shows don't end up on a stage when they're underbaked, when they're not quite developed.
So if you're working with somebody the size of the National Theatre, as you did for The Witches, which is still running until the end of this month, what stage would they be involved? Would you present to them a package, or are they involved right from the start?
So, good question. And The Witches is the outlier here because The Witches actually began the process before my department was set up.
Right.
So I joined about 6.5 years ago, and the team, I think, started working on it about 18 months before I started. So actually the model for The Witches, we're co-producers and we've been very close to the creative development, but it began in the old model of being a licensing model. So it started with the National. But typically on something like Croc, for example, I think we were sort of a couple of years in, like maybe 2.5 years in, before we started to talk to Regent's Park and Leeds Playhouse. There's a sort of sweet spot, as you can imagine, between you want to know that you've developed enough, but also you don't want to bring partners in so late that they don't have an opportunity to give feedback and to shape the direction too, because artistic directors and producers of venues know better than anybody else what works in their space. Yeah. So there's the right moment to make sure that you've got your partners on board, and we really need them.
I was looking at the ones that you've done so far. The Witches is obviously very famous, but as you've said, that wasn't initiated by you anyway. But some of the others, like The Enormous Crocodile and The Magic Finger, they're not necessarily the first ones you'd think of as Roald Dahl. You perhaps expect the more famous ones to be put out first. So why did you select those?
Well, good question. I mean, the more famous ones obviously are coming.
Yes.
It was partly about wanting to make sure that we were serving audiences well with an offering sort of diversity and multiplicity of projects. So we knew that Witches would come first and that it was going to be this kind of gorgeous, huge family musical. And also it's at the top end of sort of the darkness range for Dahl's work. It's at this top reading end in terms of age. And so we wanted to make sure that when we were bringing something out at a similar time, and as it turned out, like almost simultaneously, we wanted to make sure that we were making an offering for a different end of Dahl's audience and fans. And Croc is his youngest book. So, and also we wanted to create something that was going to be able to tour and be kind of fleet of foot and small enough that it could move around and we'd be able to reach audiences outside of London. It's gorgeous to have a great big show in London, but also we know there are Dahl fans across the country who want to be able to access the work. And for me, I really wanted to get my hands on a young piece for young children, because I felt like there was a great opportunity to make really fantastic music for that young age range. And I think it's the bit that there's just traditionally less money for development in that sort of age range, and it's sort of 3-4 upwards, and often you're restricted in terms of what you can make and what you can put on stage in order to keep ticket prices low, and because it tends to be in a daytime slot and so on. So the challenge that we presented ourselves with for Croc was to create something where the music was completely joyful and deeply accessible if you were 3 years old, but also brilliant if you're an 8-year-old sibling, and then surprisingly joyful if you're an adult and you're going to the theatre and you're like, I would listen to this. And that's exactly how I feel about Ahmed's music on Enormous Crocodile. I'm like, if somebody gave me this to listen to and put it on a Spotify list, I would dance in the kitchen to this music.
Yeah, you've got quite a lot of stories to select from them, haven't you? And they do still appeal to children and to adults as well. It's not just a nostalgia thing. There is something a bit naughty for adults as well to indulge in some of these. And there are some adult books as well. Would you possibly be looking at some of his adult stories as well?
Not yet. I think we have such an appetite for the children's canon at the moment that we haven't started to think more about the adult texts, and because also we really want to be in the family world at the moment, so that keeps us with the children's books. But I totally agree with you. A good portion of what we make, we expect and hope that adult fans will go, even if they don't have children.
Yeah, but we're not going to get Tales of the Unexpected on stage just yet.
Not just yet.
To the uninitiated, adapting a novel sounds like it must be easy compared to writing an original play. I know you've done both. So what are the challenges of actually adapting a story?
Such a good question, isn't it? I think Dahl is particularly tricky. I would never have said this until I'd come and started doing this job and worked with playwrights over the last sort of 5-6 years. And I take my hat off even more to the brilliant Dennis Kelly than I did when I started. Now I've watched like playwrights at the absolute top of their game tackle these adaptations. So I think the biggest challenge for us for adapting Dahl, I think, is about the fact that he was a master of his medium. Like he wrote really wonderful children's books, which were intended to be read episodically. And the things that he does so brilliantly, and the things that I think we love about Dahl, are things that is much harder to do on stage. So I think Dahl has a really particular voice as a narrator. And he often uses it quite lightly. So shall I go like properly geeky into Roald Dahl Story
Please
Company?
do, yes.
Oh, is that appropriate? Okay. Make sure your listeners are interested in this. Fast forward the geeky bit if you want to. So Dahl does quite a few things in his storytelling. I mean, obviously the books are very diverse and different, but there are some tropes which come up again and again, which is that you often have his voice quite a lot at the beginning, and he will let you in with a sort of democratic promise to children to like tell you the truth about something. There's a sort of like, come here and let me tell you something from a kind of child's eye view. So if you think about it like in The Witches, it's like, I'm not saying that your primary school teacher is a witch. I'm just saying she might be. And the beginning of The Twits is like, what a lot of bearded men there are in the world today. And Danny, Champion of the World, there's a kind of like, you get this very strong voice of Danny talking about what kind of a parent every child wants and deserves. So you get this Dahl narrator who often is there quite heavily at the beginning, often comes back at the end and reveals himself again, and then drops in at very key moments in the text to share what usually is a kind of a little bit of wisdom. And trying to create that narrative voice on stage, which is so much part of his kind of unique cheekiness. It's a bit dark, it's a bit humorous, it's very honest, is really difficult if you choose not to have a narrator. And so far, none of our adapters have gone down the route of having Dahl as a narrator on stage. So you've got to try and capture the tone in other ways. I think that's one big challenge. The other big challenge is that Dahl's stories often don't start until quite a way into the books. And as we know, when you're 2 hours on stage of an evening, or in the case of A Noisy Crocodile, an hour on stage, much like film, you have to start, you have to kick the action off, you have to bring the stakes up, give us a reason to be there out of our living rooms and in the theatre. So the story structuring needs to innovate away from the original. So the steer that I always give playwrights now is to try and be really faithful to the tone and to the spirit of Dahl so that fans get the thing that they love, but to feel really free to innovate away from the story structure. Because if you try and stay really reverentially close to the narrative beats, you're going to create something quite unsatisfying on stage. And theatre structure is a whole thing of its own, and it's very, very different from book structure.
Yeah. You've got to adapt it, you've got to change it in some way, and you're going to disappoint somebody who's a fan quite often, aren't you? But I remember, I think it was David Hare a long time ago, something that he'd adapted, somebody said to him, who was a fan of whatever the book was, said, you were very faithful to it, you got it all in, and he didn't think he had, because he thought he'd made some massive changes to it. But that's sort of the trick, isn't it? Making people think that it's all there without it feeling like you've just got a little bit of this scene and then a little bit of that. It's got a flow, right, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I think the best adaptations are exactly like that people feel like they've seen something that is really, really hits the spot for what they love about the original. But meanwhile, I think the creators always, and this is definitely true in Matilda, and it's very true in Witches as well, there's the presence of these contemporary artists who are mining into the story and kind of pulling out and illuminating the bits of the story that they love and that they have something to say about, which they feel resonate with today's audience. And I think that's the trick, is that it looks easy. And I think if you're doing a brilliant job of adapting and a brilliant job of creating musical theatre, it looks effortless, because it's profoundly accessible, it's profoundly populist in its soul, which is what I love about making musical theatre, is because it has the sort of populace at its heart, and it doesn't need to show off about its sophistication. But my God, the expertise and the artistry that is never shown, I think, unless you really, really know the form, is what's so kind of glorious about it, that it sits underneath all of this kind of brilliant, accessible work that everybody can just go and have a brilliant time in the theatre.
Yeah, and something like the Matilda, you can feel that the people who created that are huge fans of the work themselves, aren't they? There's a joy and there's a love for it, isn't there?
Yeah, you've got to love it, right? I mean, why do you want to adapt? This is my personal opinion as a writer as well. Why you'd want to try and adapt something you don't love, I think is really tough. Of course, the challenge then is not to be too reverential to the thing that you love, to allow yourself to love it and then respectfully take a step away and put yourself into it as well. But yeah, it always feels like a crazy task to make yourself adapt something you don't like.
Yeah. I mean, I've adapted some earlier children's books when there are pages sometimes of like a picnic in Wind in the Willows, where there are pages of just a description of all the food and things like that. Dahl doesn't really do that, does he? His books are a bit more fast moving, really, aren't they?
They are fast moving. That's so interesting, though, the thing with descriptions of food, because I think that's some of what makes, particularly in children's literature, the thing that you remember. Like, I remember the descriptions in Wind in the Willows. Yeah. So you sort of want to be able to honour that. Dahl has a bit of kind of like, his like weird, glorious detail in his stories that I think really stay with you. But you're right, they're quite, he doesn't spend a huge amount of time on them. So like, everybody remembers Gran's cigar, right? You just remember that Gran smokes a cigar because it's so weird. It's such a great detail, you know?
There are some, like a lot of children's authors, there are some aspects of Dahl that are now thought to be a bit more controversial, some of his views and some of the books as well. So I suppose you've got to work around that as well, have you?
Yeah, I think when you're in the process of adapting, you so much are handing that to the artists, because they're constantly thinking about the audience that they're putting it in front of. I think it happens quite naturally as a process of working out how you're going to tell a story and how you're going to make sure that story connects with children today in the audience. So yes, but it happens in quite a straightforward way, I think, for us in the theatre department.
So if you could pick one out of the ones that haven't been done recently to adapt, what would be your choice?
As a writer, or just generally as an artistic director?
As a writer.
The Twits. Although it has been done not that long ago. The other one, which was my favourite when I was young, was Danny Champion of the World, which hasn't been done for a long time and is just gorgeous, but a really hard one, I think, to adapt.
Yeah.
But they're probably the two personally that are closest to my heart from my own childhood.
Yeah, I've seen both of them on stage. I think I've seen both of them at Bolton Octagon in the past. But
oh, really?
Most of the existing adaptations were by David Wood, weren't they?
Yeah.
Who was on this podcast last year.
Was he? Brilliant.
Are the existing ones still going to be available, or are you gradually replacing them?
We are replacing them in a professional context. So they're still available for amateur licensing and for schools licensing, because we didn't want to leave that gap for people who want to do them now. And David created some gorgeous shows, and I think they were the kind of mainstay for a really long period of time, particularly in regional theatre, I think in Christmas shows and so on. So we wanted to create a body of work, which meant that there were shows, not just adaptations, but also shows that that we could send out into the world. And I think our appetite has changed now, particularly at a sort of family level, in terms of what we expect and want to see on stage. And so I think, having spoken at length to David about this, his core is so much in children's theatre and in serving children. And I think where we are now is very much embracing the fact that we have a big adult audience too. And so trying quite hard to serve both audiences with things like The Witches and Enormous Crocodile. And that we're trying to think about the whole range. And I think family viewing now is really different from what it was, say, in the 1980s. You think that people want to be able to go to the theatre with parents, grandparents, kids, and expect all to be equally entertained by the experience.
Yeah, David is very good at speaking at length, but he does have a massive experience of writing for theatre, and of course he worked directly with Roald Dahl, or he communicated with him. So what did you get from David and his adaptations? His original adaptations, did you get anything from those that have been useful?
No, I didn't look back to his adaptations, and I think for playwrights and for composers and so on coming to them, you sort of want to start quite fresh. That's been my experience working with all the artists and collaborators that I'm working with, is they sort of want to read the book and then they want to it's a bit like films as well. There's been a host of films. I think you quite quickly have to sort of go, this is someone else's interpretation. And now I'm going to put those things to one side and I'm going to focus on what my vision for this particular piece is. Otherwise, I think you go slightly crazy if you try and kind of keep those things in mind. And the other thing, which I think is really important about adaptation, is that I think each adaptation is so much of its time. Like if you're doing a really great adaptation, it's capturing something about now. And if you're really lucky and incredibly skilled, like, Tim and Dennis and Matthew on Matilda, then you capture something which the now stays for a really long number of years. But I think, and that's the high bar. That's what we're always aiming for. And I really think the Witches team have done that as well. I think they've created it with such integrity and care and such hard work that it will last. But, the nature of adaptation is that it sort of eventually gets replaced by the next adaptation. And then the original source material, it has that sort of timeless storyteller quality to it. So you want that to exist. You want adaptations in their time to exist as well. And then you want to be free to innovate when the right moment comes.
So just like traditional children's stories or fairy stories or folk tales, they have to be retold each generation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And those stories are there because they have something central and architectural and kind of mythological to them, don't they, that resonates with all of us. So we want to interpret them for ourselves. We want to make them our own for each generation.
Only a few years ago, of course, we've come out of a global pandemic which massively affected theatres, and it's sort of getting back to normal, but there are some theatres who didn't survive, and children's theatre in particular has traditionally been underfunded and often not rated quite at the same level. So what made you think that now was the right time to launch an initiative like this, or to launch new children's theatre?
I'd love to give you an answer that makes it sound like I was really prophetic and I thought I've worked it out. Not at all. Obviously, the pandemic was a terrible shock, I think, for the whole sector. And as you say, I think we have not fully recovered. And I think it was particularly brutal on freelancers and understanding the relationship between institutions and organizations and how we manage freelancers and our responsibilities towards them and so on. So we had already begun before that happened. We were able, because we were in development, we paused on the production end and we continued to work through development. And we did it, as everybody did, remotely by Zoom. And we made sure that we were looking after the artists that we were working with and paying them throughout the course of the pandemic and so on. And then I don't think we were waiting for a moment where we felt like it was the right time to start doing children's theatre and family theatre. I think rather what we did was we were directed by the work. And I think there's a sort of critical momentum that you reach with a piece of work where it takes on a life of its own, and it requires to go in front of an audience as quickly as possible. And I think, in some ways, having Enormous Croc and Witches on at the same time put like a lot of pressure on us, because obviously we had two shows at different ends of the country and we wouldn't necessarily have planned it that way. But actually that was the moment where those two projects just needed to go on stage. And so I think that's how it came about. I think it was not a response to the sort of the sectoral needs, but more a response to each group of artists and the piece of work that they'd been, gestating over those years.
Well, have you found approaching theatres at this time, have you found that some of them have been maybe a little reluctant to commit too much to a new work more than before?
I think we're really fortunate. I'm sure that is the case. And I know that certainly from colleagues. But I think we're really fortunate with the name of Dahl. And I think that it generally is a name. And, not every title. Some titles are definitely harder to sell, as you say, the ones that are a bit less well known. But I do think that people will book, particularly if there's if it's supported by the theatre and they're originating it with us. I think audiences are prepared to take a chance, even on a title like Enormous Crocodile. And certainly the incredible critical response to Witches, I hope, and to Croc will mean that partners are even more inclined to want to do a Dahl. But we've been fortunate enough not to have that problem.
And these are musical adaptations mostly. Is it mostly musicals that you're looking for?
We've got a mix actually in development in our pipeline. So they're not all. We've announced our circus, so everyone knows there's a big Dahl circus coming. So it's not exclusively musicals. And again, I will be dictated in terms of form on each individual story. So I think there are some stories that want to be a musical, and some stories that want to be a straight play, and some that I think are neither, and that we might kind of like look at forms outside of that. That's how the circus came about. So yeah, I think it's a combination of the individual titles and the form that I think will best serve the spirit and the tone and the dullness of it. And then obviously I'm influenced by the opinion of artists who I'm having conversations with. And if somebody comes in with a brilliant idea about how to adapt something, I'm very happy for it not to have been my idea and to take on somebody else's excellent idea if they've got a good persuasive argument.
Yeah. And who'd have thought like 20 years ago that the largest producer of musicals on stage would be Disney? I mean, so there is a market for it, isn't there?
Disney's a really useful model, right? I completely agree with you. And they know their IP incredibly well. They know what their fans really, really want. And they're pretty good at handing it to the experts on stage, and letting them take on that brand, often in the case of Disney, and that intellectual property. And, and they balance between, like I said, the kind of innovation. I mean, I think the Lion King was the sort of precursor to all of it. Was, somebody brilliant saying, actually, let's bring Julie Taymor in, and Julie having the idea of the mask and and then suddenly you've got a beloved film that's made its way to being a just as beloved and maybe more iconic piece of musical theatre.
Can you give any hints about what we've got in store?
Obviously we've done Magic Finger. We know Magic Finger is being released in the spring, so that's coming. And I have to say, I have to do such a shout out for the Magic Finger because it's so delightful. Like, the aim of the Magic Finger was really to make work that we felt was free at the point of access, but was as artistically good as the things that we were making, both at a sort of Croc touring level and then at the kind of large family scale for Witches. We wanted to make something which had the same gorgeous artistic integrity. but was free to schools. And we wanted to make sure that we were reaching audiences who may not make it into a theatre. And what they have come up with is just Millie Bhatia and Shanko Chowdhury have come up with is so gorgeous. We will definitely do something similar to Magic Finger, another iteration with a different title. And then Circus is our first one, which is multi-title. So you expect to see lots of characters from different novels in the same show. And then after that, I'm not ready to tell you what we're doing next, but I promise you there will be some of the big hitters in there that you would expect to see, and hopefully with the odd unexpected one as well.
So how much fun is your job then?
I know, right? Imagine what my life is like when I have to tell someone what I do. It makes happen for the first time and I explain what I do and they're like, what? That's so great. Yes, I feel honestly very grateful every day for getting to do this.
That was Jenny Worton, Artistic Director of Theatre at the Roald Dahl Story Company. The National Theatre production of The Witches finishes its current run on the South Bank on the 27th of January 2024. See www.nationaltheatre.org for more details. For information about the Roald Dahl Story Company and any upcoming projects, see www.roalddahl.com.
You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.